say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? This motion moves forward, and our next discussion item is a presentation on the eviction and calls for service study by our Police Conduct Oversight Commission. And if our staff members could please guide us through this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Kano, Council Vice President Jenkins, council members. My name is Imani Jafar. I'm the director of the Office of Police Conduct Review. Today, I'm going to be presenting to you the study that we did that focuses on the Conduct on Licensed Premises Ordinance. We, as the staff of the Office of Police Conduct Review, did this at the request of the Police Conduct Oversight Commission, but we did it in conjunction with some very important community partners who came to attend the presentation today. Director Luke Grunman from Mid-Minnesota Legal Assistance, and Larry McDonough, who's a housing attorney who's nationally known and is currently working at Dorsey and Whitney, but worked for Legal Aid for many, many years. Larry is going to leave early to get his daughter on the bus. So just so you know when he gets up. But today, our intention here is to give you an overview of the issue and the topic and how it came to the attention of the commission, and then also talk about some of the areas that arose as things that you should focus on. So the landlord training management plans, lockouts, which were a collateral issue that we didn't actually go into the study intending to research, but were voiced by so many advocates that we worked into this study. Ryan Patrick, who is the legal analyst for our office, is going to go through a data review, and then we'll go through what the Police Conduct Oversight Commission's recommendations were. So first, as we get into this topic, Luke Grunman and his colleague Georgina Santos came to the commission specifically to address the issue of police interaction related to conduct on premises ordinance, and made a presentation to the PCOC that kind of launched this study. So to get a handle on it, we thought what we'd do first is go through the relevant law. So first is actually the Conduct on Licensed Premises Ordinance itself, which is 244.2020. Now, conduct on licensed premises is an ordinance that is essentially triggered when a property is classified as disorderly or a problem property, and then the city involvement triggers from that point. And we're going to talk a lot about what that flow is and how it can really impact the residents in the city of Minneapolis. Conduct on premises is a very wide-ranging ordinance. So things as small as an underage drinking violation in a rental property can trigger it, all the way up to like serious drug trafficking and use. So the consequences are the same despite a wide variety of crimes. So that's something that can be problematic that was raised by a lot of the advocates. There are two primary entities in the city that are in charge of enforcement: the Minneapolis Police Department and Regulatory Services. Now, as this ordinance came about in 1990, and as it kind of progressed, a lot of the enforcement fell on MPD. It went from kind of a co-responder sort of program that had a civilian and a cop paired together called SAFE that seemed to be very popular, but then lost its funding. And then it went to crime prevention specialists, and then it went to one person to enforce the entire ordinance and do the training. So that's a lot on one person. So a big discussion with, and we'll talk through who the community partners were about how that's working. The next thing to know is the notices that get sent out to landlords as a result of some kind of criminal activity on the property can actually lead to a notice to vacate, which is a more subtle version of an eviction, essentially. So asking someone to leave without filing anything, but can actually lead to a formal eviction. So where the eviction law is 504B. 504B285 is kind of the general eviction statute in Minnesota, but there's two areas that popped out during the study. One is domestic violence protection. So under 504B.205, if you have been the victim of domestic violence, then you should be exempted from conduct on licensed premises. And that's a protection that is something we'll talk about later about how it's being administered. The other thing is there's a protection against lockouts, that a landlord cannot just lock a tenant out. If they want to properly remove them from a property, then they have to go through steps within a court of law. And a lockout is, as Larry McDonough raised during the study, usually a cost-benefit analysis for the landlords who engage in them, saying that it's probably cheaper to just lock them out than file an eviction. So typically a tenant will come home and their property will be locked. But there's a specific protection against that in the law. So the participants we interviewed for the study, Mid-Minnesota Legal Assistance, Homeline, a tenant advocacy group that many of you are probably familiar with, Larry McDonough, who's here with us, Commander Charlie Adams, who's leading kind of the changes that are undergoing in the department, Sergeant Jeff Egge and his analyst, Brian Smith from the innovation team, Noah Shuckman, who's the Director of Regulatory Services, and Councilmember Cunningham, because he had already started leading work on the ordinance itself, and we wanted to capture kind of what was happening at the time we presented this. So to go into the areas of concern, one was the landlord training. So as I mentioned before, it had gotten to the point where things have already actually started changing as we looked into the issue, which is the good news. But at the time that we started looking into the issue, landlord training was conducted by one person who was solely focusing on eviction and legal advice. So what was happening was that landlords who were going to start being a landlord going through training in the city of Minneapolis were attending a training where the primary focus was if a problem comes up with someone, no matter how small, a good way to resolve this is to evict or remove them from the property. And just for your review, we actually we got all of the materials from those trainings so you could kind of get an idea of what was going on before. There was police involvement in the training, and there was a considerable amount of concern about the tone that sets with the landlord. So is that maybe a scary thing to walk into a room to see that a police officer is training that there's a huge consequence, right? That maybe I'm going to just have to evict if this looks like I need to evict. So that was an issue is that the right place for the police? And the police were specifically concerned about whether that was the right place for them too. And were probably the first entity that voiced concern about that not being a great fit. And there was overarching concern between advocates, between city enterprise officials that we talked to, and the police department about how to create the right tone between police and landlords so that it is a more community-based approach, that even if a tenant ends up leaving a property, that it's something that can be done in a more positive way to start that process. Of course, evictions are going to happen, but limiting it to the situations where they're absolutely necessary and not essentially marketing evictions as a first line of defense or first way to respond to a conduct unlicensed premises violation. So the second thing that's all part of this is the management plan. So let's say you're a landlord, you have a tenant that has, for some reason has triggered one of these conduct unlicensed premises issues. So the next thing that would happen is you would receive a management plan in the mail, and that plan gives you 10 days to respond. We also put sample language in the study that you can see about what the management plans look like. And the management plans really, kind of push the idea of a notice to vacate. Notice to vacate is problematic for the city looking at this problem because a notice to vacate isn't tracked anywhere. When a landlord was sending a tenant a notice to vacate, it was just, it doesn't have to be reported back. There's no statistics on how often. A lot of tenants are very afraid if they receive one, they're going to be evicted anyway. And evictions can be devastating for people. They stay on your record for 10 years. They're incredibly hard to expunge. There's a lot of difficulties with navigating having an eviction on your record. So people will leave out of fear. You all likely know this, but because the vacancy rate in Minneapolis rental property is hovering around 2%, it's difficult to even find new places to live. So it's kind of apropos that we're coming right after the homelessness issue, because this can be something that can contribute to homelessness. So the appearance of a requirement to oust the tenants was completely problematic. The other thing that we found was, in talking to all the advocates, was the state law protections that I mentioned earlier, specifically the VAWA, domestic violence protections, were mentioned nowhere in the notice. So, and the other thing was that the tenants weren't getting notice at all. So notice was going out to the landlord, block club leaders, and in some instances, the Hennepin County Attorney's Office, but never to the tenants. So a lot of times, for those of you more familiar with domestic violence calls, it may not come across in the first instance of a domestic violence call. It might be a neighbor calling for noise, but the noise might be coming from a domestic violence incident. So if you were the tenant who's a victim of domestic violence, you got no notice of this and no opportunity to respond. And there was nothing built into the notices. So everyone was very concerned about that. And the other thing was the accuracy. When you have one person who's in charge of this huge job of sending all of these out, you can't catch those issues. You may not be able to have time to comb through the underlying analysis. So, there was a lot of concern that this was too big of a job for one person. And should this really be housed in the police department if it's going to be affecting rental licensing? So those were the type of discussions that we were having. So lockouts was the collateral issue that I mentioned that came up, which I talked about before. A landlord changes the locks and the tenant's personal items are usually removed, either put on a sidewalk, they're put in a storage unit. Specifically for low-income tenants, that can be very devastating. It can be hard. They can lose all of their belongings and have zero way to get them back. They are, in fact, illegal in the state of Minnesota. However, and even with our discussions with the police department, they had said that they've trained for many years that it's a civil matter. Well, actually, it's a criminal matter. It's a misdemeanor. It can be cited. And if you're looking especially at landlords who are using it in a cost-benefit analysis, what better way to get them to stop doing than to actually cite it? So a lot of the feedback we got is this is a huge problem. It's often related to conduct on premises issues. So maybe they've gotten a notice and they just lock the person out and then they want to be done with it. But a better way to resolve it would be a more community-based way. And if these landlords do know that Minneapolis police officers are trained and will issue them a citation on this, then that could help stop the problem. So that was a big discussion point that came kind of very connected to the issue we were looking at. So now I'm going to turn it over to legal analyst Ryan Patrick to talk about the data that we used to kind of get the results for the study.
Thank you, Director Jafar, Chair Cano. We received a lot of data from the Minneapolis Police Department. They were very cooperative, data spanning all the way up to 2017, way back to the 90s. So we had a lot of data to analyze for this report, and we decided to look at it in 3 different ways. So what, out of the overall data set, what could we learn from it? We picked a sample out of that data set, a smaller sample, to be able to determine whether or not any of those instances in that sample kind of ran afoul of those state law protections, and I'll discuss that again. And then within that sample, reading all the reports, reading the dispatch logs, looking at the information, what can we glean? What is actually going on in those calls? And just first, the majority of the time, conduct on licensed premises enforcement occurs as the result of a warrant where officers are seizing evidence of narcotics, weapons. Frequently, this is being used in the way that it was intended, where you have a house that involves narcotics trafficking. Well, that's not always the case. But narcotics was by far the most frequent trigger. And so the general category is narcotics, but we know within narcotics, you have everything ranging from small amount for personal use, residue in a baggie, all the way up to pounds and pounds of drugs that are going on the street to be sold. So narcotics is pretty vague, and I'll talk about some specific instances that show kind of the range of narcotics when I get to some of the individual cases. Another thing we noticed looking at the larger data set was that 72 different neighborhoods in Minneapolis had properties that were affected by the conduct on premises ordinance, but just 8 of those represented 51% of the notices, went to just 8 neighborhoods, and those were in specifically North Minneapolis. If you look at the study, those neighborhoods are called out. So where is this ordinance being applied most frequently? Well, we know that over half of them are occurring in just 8 out of the 72 different neighborhoods. One of the other areas for concern with the data was that while we have information on where the property was, who the landlord was, the fact that a management plan was issued, and a satisfactory management plan was returned, we don't know the outcomes. We don't, after the enforcement occurs, after a notice to vacate goes out, we don't really know what happens. We're missing data kind of on the back end and really the human impact resulting from enforcement. So like I mentioned,
If I could just pause for 1 second, going back to the other slide, could you go back 1 slide? I'm curious, do you have the breakdown of where the other 49% of the issues lie? So clearly there's a kind of a concentration here in North Minneapolis of 51%. I'm wondering if the rest of it is scattered throughout the city, or if you do see kind of, 30% bulk here, 20% bulk here. Is that information?
I can certainly provide that information. I'm not sure if the neighborhood by neighborhood breakdown is in the report, but yeah, there are other pockets.
Are there other pockets?
Concentration, okay. And then the rest are kind of spread.
Okay, I was kind of wondering if there were other kind of like, maybe not as, the numbers weren't as high, but were still considered like a concentration of.
Yeah, Chair Cano, certainly not as high a concentration, but I can certainly provide the breakdown neighborhood by neighborhood and across years.
Yeah, I'd be curious. And then just a technical question on the word narcotics. Does that include marijuana possession, or
It appeared to in some cases, yeah.
Okay, because I know we're trying to look at that issue through a different lens, and just curious how that's playing out in this. So from the legal definition of the term narcotics, it would involve any calls surrounding
Yeah.
possession of marijuana or usage of it, I guess.
Yeah, Chair Cano, the range in narcotics varies pretty extensively in police coding. So some of this comes down to what an actual call or the police report, what coding was entered into the report, be it narcotics, because they seized a large amount of marijuana versus heroin. We see the whole gamut in the cases. So.
Okay, thank you.
So we selected a sample of sufficient size that if we went through every case and were able to determine that, in fact, these were your hallmark classic enforcement cases where they're seizing a large amount of drugs or weapons, if we saw that across the entire sample, we could safely conclude with 95% certainty that the ordinance was working as expected, not running afoul of those state law protections. However, within the sample, we located one case. We highlighted domestic violence specifically because of our past report that we presented, but also because it's very clearly called out in both federal and state protections. We did locate a case where a domestic partner assaulted another, strangulation, weapon involved, fled the property, was arrested a short time later, and it triggered a conduct on premises enforcement notice. The address for the person who committed the assault was not the address of the rental property and where the conduct on premises notice was sent to that specific landlord. So we can be pretty certain that it was applied to the person who was living in the unit, who was not the assaulter, but was in fact the person who called 911 because they were being abused. And therefore, because of that located in the sample, we conclude the error rate is not zero. And these are state law protections. When we're talking about an acceptable rate of error, an error rate of not zero is unacceptable. And so within that sample, because it's a smaller sample, we're looking at cases. If we're seeing stuff pop up within those cases, we can likely conclude that it's not an isolated incident. And there were a number of other issues that popped up that we found worth further examination, and in future discussions about how this is applied, it may be worth taking into consideration. So for instance, multiple cases where in the police report you saw a variety of young children present who were living at the property. So an example case, officers had a warrant to arrest somebody. They knew that that person frequented one of their family members' houses. They arrested the person at that family member's house, and they had a gun on them at the time. So the weapons arrest occurred at that property. The police report notes when they did the arrest that a variety of young children under 10 were present. Conduct on premises kicked in. The notice was sent. Another instance we saw were notices being sent for violations occurring in sober living facilities or halfway houses for narcotics specifically. So you have a sober living facility where you have support staff there working with tenants to address their issues with narcotics. Perhaps they're in a better position to determine whether that person should stay in the unit than the ordinance. We saw multiple cases where people called for service because a heroin overdose was occurring. Officers came, they administered Narcan, saved the person's life, but because there were narcotics located at the property, the conduct on premises enforcement occurred. And we certainly don't want to have a chilling effect and push people out of their housing when they're dealing with, obviously, drug dependency issues. Now we know that this person has drug dependency issues. If you're forcing them out to an unknown location, how are you going to provide follow-up services after that? We saw instances where there were juvenile suspects who were living with their parents, so they did some form of criminal activity outside of the property, but they were arrested at the house. So you have 13, 14-year-olds engaging in criminal activity, but then their parents are really bearing the brunt of this by being essentially not being able to live in their rental property anymore. So they're dealing with both the criminal justice system's interaction with their child and trying to find new housing at the same time. And then mental health issues. So people were experiencing mental health issues. That's what led the police to come to the property in the first place. One instance of a person reporting a fake assault because they wanted to be killed by the police when they arrived. So they set up a situation in which they thought they were going to be shot by the police when they arrived. They weren't. The officers handled it well and got the person to crisis. But since that call was tagged as an assault, not that one occurred, it triggered that conduct on premises enforcement again. So those are the areas in the data that we saw kind of highlighted some of the issues that we heard from the advocates. We did see those pop up in the data and wanted to bring it to your attention. I'll turn it back over to the director. Thank you.
Thank you. And Chair Cano, to your question too, Mr. Patrick did include a visual of the data he collected for the neighborhood pockets. So in the back of the report, you can actually kind of see where those pockets are in a visual complete map. Thank you. Of course. So for the recommendations that the commission voted, finalized the report, and that's why we're presenting to you now, here are the things that they came away with that they wanted to recommend. One is updating the landlord training. The nice thing that happened during this is that as we started to interview people from the Minneapolis Police Department, they did start to look into what was going on in the training and put it on hold. They actually scaled back the training, took the crime prevention specialist who was doing it off of the training, put community engagement team officers to do a small 6-page or 7-page PowerPoint on conduct on licensed premises, and put regulatory services in more of a role to do the training. So that's happening, but it really is kind of a Band-Aid right now. It needs to be a more formalized training. And a couple of the things that really came out a lot during the interviews was education on equity and fair housing, giving landlords in Minneapolis the tools so that they can equitably deal with tenants and deal with them in a fair way, and that they know the fair housing law so that they're not discriminating, whether it's on purpose or accidentally. So using those trainings as a way to give landlords better tools to deal with the residents is really crucial. Another thing that the police department was the first entity to say this, but using non-MPD trainers. There were even suggestions that a crime prevention specialist could attend the training just to introduce themselves as a resource for landlords, but that taking this focus off of, almost one of the words that was used in one of the meetings was scaring the landlords into thinking they had to evict at the first sign of an issue, even if it's something as small as some of the incidents that Mr. Patrick described, that's not a good way to go about things. And that's not the community that a lot of people wanted to live and work in, and that there are just better ways to address this. So potentially shifting the focus to having regulatory services doing the trainings, but having the equity groups within the city participate in fashioning those trainings to make sure that all of the right information is being captured. The next thing was revising the ordinance, which that work is underway. And we tried to capture in this study what Councilmember Cunningham has done. I've been in those meetings. I think the direction is very positive. There's a clear end date. There are clear goals going, and that it addresses a lot of the issues that we raised in the report. But I think one consistent thing that we heard was the ordinance doesn't need to be thrown away. But what it needs is a lot of work to clarify the enforcement and how it should be carried out. That some of these things are happening because the ordinance itself just needs more clarity within it, and figuring out ways, for example, to create a management plan process. So you don't have one person running, that you have some kind of formal mechanism that can have oversight, and that you can make sure that management plans are going to the right people in the right way, and that those protections for things like domestic violence that are very important are worked in, and that people aren't getting targeted who are quite vulnerable. And along with that, improving the screening mechanism, making sure that the people getting management plans are the people who should be getting management plans, and that we're making sure to abide by state law in doing that. The last is one of the last things is changing the notice of the violation. So providing options, so that heavy focus on evictions or notice to vacate was something that was consistently across the board everyone wanted to see gone. There were other suggestions in the report, such as cash for keys, where you agree on a move out date. A landlord will return, the security deposit. Tenant gives the keys and they're done, and everyone can go on their separate ways. Another thing that was brought up was, mutual lease termination negotiations doing that. One thing that came up in Councilmember Cunningham's group is using a community navigator, having someone go out to figure out what's actually going on, especially in the lower level situations, and seeing if there's more positive ways to resolve it. So letting landlords know, this is part of giving them the tools to respond better, that there are other options, that eviction should be seen as a last resort. There are still going to be instances where eviction is the only option, and no one's saying that that should be off the table. But I think understanding how difficult it is for both landlords to file and go through evictions and tenants to then defend and bear the eviction afterwards it's a cost on both sides. So there are just other more collaborative methods you can go through first. So having that notice kind of reflect that is really key. Sending it to both landlords and tenants. I think a lot of people, including the commission, were concerned that tenants weren't getting notice. Taking the Hennepin County Attorney's Office out of it, unless there's a formal discovery request in conjunction with a trial, but no proactive notices. Also, the block club leaders, that just puts pressure on a landlord, where if it's a lower level situation that can be resolved, let the landlord and tenant resolve that. Also an opportunity to respond. So if we can't catch those domestic violence calls because they don't appear on their face as domestic violence, having an opportunity to respond can be that tenant victim's ability to say, hey, well, this like party, loud noise that my neighbor called on, well, it's because, my partner was assaulting me, and that's why this is happening. I need protection. And then you can get them in conjunction with other services as well. So that there's a win-win in that, but having some sort of opportunity to respond. Another thing that was mentioned in conjunction with the Hennepin County Attorney's notification was that sheriff's data was occasionally being used. And, being the city of Minneapolis, that's probably not a best practice to be using the sheriff's data. So just using that at all should be excluded. You can use police reporting and referral to handle those calls. And notice to any outside parties, like we discussed before, it really should be landlord and tenant focused so the problem can be resolved in the best way. And then this one's a little bit simpler, I think, to carry out, but in-service training for police officers to address lockouts. Larry McDonough, who is here, has actually done some training for the cadets, but cadets are new officers. We need to train the officers who are actually on the street to redo this, because it's been many, many years of them thinking lockouts are a civil matter. So we really kind of need to re-educate here and give them the tools they need to deal with it, because it's a really serious issue. And for some of you, it occurs in your wards more than others. And so that can be a good way to take care of it. We think that it's probably easier for the city to contract with outside trainers to do that rather than create a conflict of interest within the city on those cases. And honestly, any one of the advocacy organizations that we interviewed, and there are many others, could conduct that training. City data collection, as Mr. Patrick mentioned, mandatory reporting for all notices to vacate. I think that is a huge gap that was identified during the study, that it's of interest to all of us to know when a landlord issues a notice to vacate and if the tenant actually leaves. And then also saying if it results in an eviction. So if they don't leave. And even in the innovation team study, which we included as an appendix in the report, you can actually see there's kind of this gap about knowing how these are related. So if, as part of their licensing requirement, if you just require them to report this back or require it as part of the management plan, then you're going to capture all that data and you can really see what's going on. And also reporting all occupants. I think Mr. Patrick did a nice job of mentioning all of the young people who are affected. So that way you can also grab some numbers about how many children are affected by this. So really understanding that you're going to need the landlords to really report notices to vacate to get a better handle. And we thought as well, having a public dashboard with non-identifying information would even give residents answers to some of these questions, and also a snapshot for city leadership to help them make better decisions about this issue. I know that was a lot of information, and the report has a lot of appendices, but we'd be happy to take any questions from you if you have more questions.
One question or comment from Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Director Jafar and Mr. Patrick, for all your hard work. This is an issue that I came into office already focused on, because 5 out of the 8 neighborhoods that make up the 51% are in my ward, and I live in one of them. I share, granted, 2 of them with Ward 5, but this is a huge, huge issue in my ward. And it's an issue for many folks. I think that it's been this part. first of all, I read from beginning to end of this research. It's wonderful. Thank you for all your hard work. You guys are on fire with the research. And I also wanted to say, though, that, here it's telling the untold story of the conduct on licensed premises ordinance. Because, when I was out talking to folks in my community, the things that I heard were, it's the renters. They're bad landlords. But it really emphasized that it's bad renters and we need to get renters out. The problem properties, the only way to address them, they're all this extreme, right? It's like this extreme of next thing I know, my neighbors are probably selling drugs. And so therefore they're making a lot of assumptions. And so I really appreciate this part of the story because, and having it quantified, because when I'm talking to folks, they don't believe me. They don't believe me that this is being misused to harm people, particularly vulnerable renters. And another big thing that's kind of a gap, but we've talked about it in the work group, is that we know that chronic criminal and disruptive behavior is not exclusive to rental properties. And so looking at how that lens has created a narrative in North Minneapolis, which is also racial, because when we look at who are renters and who are homeowners, that has put a lot of tension, racial tension in particular, in our community. So thank you very much for all your hard work on this, to be able to name the challenges of those who don't have a voice and who are experiencing the harm of this ordinance being implemented historically the way that it has been. I'm grateful for this because it answered a lot of the questions that I came in asking about, well, what happens when it gets activated? Because it hasn't been transparent and clear. So thank you so much for naming it out. I was right now finally mapping what the process looked like with more clarity. And I think we're going to get some really, really good work done in our work group. So thank you so much for all of this.
You're most welcome.
We have another comment or question from Council Vice President Andrea Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Ms. Jafar. So I'm curious, is notice to vacate, is that a legal proceeding? Because you asked that, you recommend that should be a mandatory report.
Chair Kano, Council Vice President Jenkins, it is not a legal proceeding, but they are usually very formal looking notices. And if you look at the management plan notice, the way it was going out, there was suggestions in notice to vacate, and the training had a lot of information about notices to vacate.
Mhm.
But they are kind of formal letters and documents. They don't typically go through the court, but a lot of times a landlord will just issue one to a tenant saying, if you don't leave in 7 days or you don't leave in 2 weeks, I'll file an eviction against you. If the notice to vacate is issued, a landlord could report back saying that, I sent the tenant a notice to vacate, and then they can report back if they actually left. So I think the helpfulness in having that is because it is a mechanism that is happening specifically in response to a conduct on licensed premises violation. You can see how many times, if a letter is being sent out by the city, the tenant is actually leaving. And it doesn't mean that it's a bad situation that they leave or not, but I think it would be important to capture how often the tenants are actually leaving, because that was a question that we asked, well, how many people are turning over homes? And that was a question that we couldn't get answered. And one interesting thing that happened was we actually presented a continuing legal education course yesterday with MMLA. And one of the landlord attorneys brought up how difficult this issue is for landlords and how much pressure they feel to vacate. And that, kind of indicating that they wouldn't mind tracking it. But the other thing they said too is that with a notice to vacate, they don't often want to do that, but they feel pressured by the city. And so that's, I think, as you change the notices themselves about the management plan and what people do, it would just be good to track that information.
And who would they report it to?
So I think that the work group should probably sit down and discuss who it should report to. Our gut instinct was regulatory services, just because ultimately it can impact a landlord's licensing. So if they have that information about the notice to vacates and they collect it, that could be one space, but there's other spaces in the city where it could go to. But I think it would benefit from a look with community partners and people within the city to decide what exactly should be collected, how it gets collected, and who it goes to.
Okay. And then do we have clarity around how much the percentage of evictions are related to inability to pay as opposed to some of these other challenges with criminal
Chair,
behavior and drug use and all of that stuff?
Chair Connell and Council Vice President Jenkins. So the innovation team has done some work on the evictions, but I can tell you, even from, I had a previous life as a housing attorney representing tenants. The difficulty is that even when the underlying issue is something different, a lot of times it gets filed as a failure to pay, that the inability to pay, or just saying that they haven't paid their rent. But sometimes a tenant is holding on to their rent because they feel like they've been treated unfairly. They don't have repairs. So the innovation team has done a great job at a first slice at the eviction, and their study is in ours. We put it as an appendix so you can see the numbers. But I understand from interviewing them for this project, they're doing further work to try and drill down to the actual causes. But my understanding is non-payment of rent is often the most cited reason for eviction. But just having worked in that field, it's often a lot more complicated than non-payment of rent.
Thank you.
You're
Thank you so
welcome.
much.
And we have a question or comment from Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Director Jafar, for this report. I think it's really valuable. I want to kind of pick up on this theme of landlords feeling pressure to evict, and I'm wondering if we've taken full stock of sort of where that comes from. You mentioned the trainings that the city is doing, but it feels a little bit bigger than that. And I think referencing Councilmember Cunningham's comments about the sort of almost neighborhood perception of like, that's a bad landlord, they let people with criminal records stay there. There's a social pressure that I think we need to change the narrative on as we sort of think about how this is going to get enacted. I also think that I'm wondering if we've talked to enough landlords to understand all the pressures that are on them. Does it impact their insurance? Are there professional association trainings outside of what the city's doing that are reinforcing that narrative? Are they talking amongst themselves and comparing notes and identifying, ways that they sort of create this story about what they're obligated to do? So I'm curious if beyond the trainings that are provided, if we understand how that pressure is getting created.
Chair Cano, Councilmember Fletcher, I think it's a really good question. You can see from the report, it's very multifaceted, right? The training is one part of it, but when you get a notice that kind of reinforces that, well, an easy way to handle this within 10 days, which is a very short turnaround time, is to just send a notice to vacate, that there's that, plus the feeling that you're afraid that you may lose your license. And you can kind of see just there's this consistent theme and fear. And if the notices for the management plan and the violation of conduct on premises are going to block club leaders and other people in the neighborhood who may be aware, it's creating a pressure cooker, right? And it was interesting to hear from a landlord attorney yesterday that in a lot of his clients' cases, he said that they actually didn't want to evict the tenant. They would have rather worked it out, but they're feeling too much pressure. And so I think, a good plan of action could be to start fixing the nuts and bolts parts of it first, cleaning up the areas that may be able to do that with a lot of people who are frankly already looking at the issue and have been talking about it for a while, but are just kind of waiting for the opportunity to kind of repair that. And then I think, also bringing the community in and talking to landlords is valuable about how they feel about those violations. But I do think there's strain on both sides. It's a tenant and landlord. And a lot of landlords you talk to will tell you that evictions are hard to carry out too, because they have to pay to file. You have to come to court. It's usually a process that isn't pleasant for either party. So I think having a more transparent way that helps residents and their landlords work out things is a better way to go. And I know in Councilmember Cunningham's group, there's a lot of talk about, using the community navigators as a way to facilitate what is actually going on. And if something like that was to go forward, or something like the SAFE program that they used to have, you can kind of correct a lot of those narratives just by doing good work in the community. But I think you're right that it'll take kind of a multifaceted approach to get at all those ways and to kind of change the tone. But people are very familiar from what we found in the research with the current system. And I think just changing that is going to have a big impact right away. And then the rest of it will have to be worked on. And
then when you talked about trainings for landlords, you talked about training them on the way we currently train them on these notices to vacate. But when you talked about training about lockouts, you talked about training officers. And I'm wondering, do we train landlords? And do we take advantage of those trainings when we have opportunities to get landlords in the room to tell them that lockouts are violations of law and to make sure that those expectations are clear?
Chair Cowner and Councilmember Fletcher, I think that would be a great idea. Because I think some people do things because they don't have information, and some people don't realize what the potential consequences could be. And if you are letting people know that, hey, this is a criminal violation, both for the officers, and if you work that into the landlord training to say there are other ways to resolve this, you will likely see change. You're welcome.
We have another comment or question from Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Upon my analysis of this particular ordinance, really, I feel like one of the underlying issues is that I feel like it's fundamentally flawed because of the pressure that it puts on landlords to regulate their tenants' behaviors. There's no research that shows that that is actually an effective way of lowering crime and criminal behavior, individuals or on the neighborhood level. And so as we are looking at revamping really this ordinance, it's really we're addressing a lot of those pressures that have been put onto landlords of, I did not know that I have a tenant who was going to commit criminal behaviors on the premises that I rented to them. So that should not be the responsibility necessarily of the landlord to figure out how to regulate that behavior, whereas we have other mechanisms that are in place in other ways. So pulling that all together, but I just wanted to name that because we talked a lot about landlord pressures, but fundamentally we have the pressure on them to regulate their tenants' behaviors, and that's an unrealistic approach to modifying behavior. Wanted to share, folks had talked about landlords and landlord advocacy groups having a voice. We are, as a part of the timeline in the work group, we are having community work groups who are going to be giving feedback and engaged in the process. They're going to be giving thoughts before we really get into the writing component, and then feedback on what we create. So I want to let folks know that we're going to be really intentional about getting as many stakeholders at the table. And so my question that I have is, we talked about the I-Team's eviction study and their role. They're at the table with this work group. I know that they've created a landlord training to address this concern. What happened with that? Where's it at? How does it fit into what we're doing moving forward?
Chair Cano, Councilmember Cunningham. So that the I-Team did work quite a bit on landlord training and had input and I think some cooperation from regulatory services. It was implemented for a very short time and then stopped. So there's already good training materials out there for the work group to convene and look at, but I think they probably, with the new results and information they have access to and what the old training looked like, I think this would be a great time to revisit that. And we specifically named the innovation team in the work group because they have done so much work on it. It doesn't really make sense. I think it would be a great opportunity to take what they've worked on and expand on that. And just to your point about the ordinance, I mean, the birth of these ordinances in the United States came as a result of the crack house epidemic, in the 80s. And they just haven't changed much across the nation since that time. So I think there was that idea that, this landlord is enabling all this criminal activity and and it was terrible. But then when the focus shifted and there were all these smaller crimes and they became the bulk of what the enforcement was, the question became, is this what this really was supposed to be? And so I think it's a really good thing that the revision of the ordinance is already underway and looking at how do we make it work for the modern time.
Just to share with my colleagues, there are 59 other cities that have conduct on premises similar problem property ordinances, and across the country this has disproportionately harmed low-income Black and Brown folks. And so as we are moving forward with our work here at the city, we are being very intentional about completely couching it in equity. We have Joy and her team at the table to make sure that we're looking at it from an equity perspective. But in comparison to other cities, we got some work ahead of us to make sure that we're actually holding folks accountable while also not causing harm to vulnerable folks as well. So thank you so much for all your work, team.
Well, without further questions, thank you so much for this very informative and important study. Appreciate all the engagement from the council members on this topic and your work on this issue. Thank you.
you.
So our final item for